All right, today, today we're gonna talk about the P Diddy case and the Cassie case, and I just want to start off by saying that this is not about celebrity. It's not about guilt or innocent. He was found not guilty by the courts on most of his charges. I'm not actually even going to share any of my thoughts or opinions on that. What I am going to say is that this isn't about tabloid headlines. This is about what this talk is about. This is about something even deeper. This is about what those allegations actually reveal about how power works in relationship and how coercion hides in plain sight and how power and influence can be used as weapons just as much as physical intimidation can. Because if you've been following the news, you may have seen the headlines about P. Diddy, Sean Combs, and a lot of the testimonies have surfaced. And I know that some of those stories are really hard to hear. But for many survivors like us, they're actually not that shocking. Why? Because there's actually something familiar about it. Because what was described in the courtroom, the manipulation, the grooming, the control, the silence, the trauma bonding, that's not actually very rare. And many of us have become victims to it because it's like this invisible architecture of so many toxic relationships. This live isn't about the trial or the verdict. It's about the patterns and the relationship dynamics. It's about what happened behind closed doors long before the world ever decided to look behind the surface. It's about how someone like Cassie, someone who can make choices, can be made to believe that they're lucky or that they're special, while being slowly stripped of their voice, of their agency, and even of their own reality. And if you ever, stayed too long in a relationship that didn't feel safe, if you've ever felt like you were the one that was being punished for having boundaries, and this conversation is important to watch. And you can post your comments in the comments thread below. Because what this conversation is about coercive control. And it's not just what it looks like on the outside, but what it actually feels like on the inside, how it trains you, how it traps you into it. And more importantly, how you begin to get your power back afterwards, because this is about liberation, not from a person, but from the system that they built around you. So let's begin by naming what most people miss. Coercion sometimes sounds like, you know how much I've done for you? And I know it can feel like love because that's what makes it so hard to name. And that's where we're going to start, right at the very beginning. What does grooming look like when it hides inside praise, affection, and desire? What does it look like? Because we don't understand that, we'll keep blaming survivors for not leaving, when what we really need to start asking is, what system made it so hard for them to go? So let's talk about how it starts, because it almost never starts with fear. It actually starts with attention, with praise, with admiration, with someone seeing something in you that maybe no one else has ever seen before. And maybe they call you brilliant, or maybe they say that you're special. Maybe they offer you like an opportunity or affection or intensity that comes on so fast that your nervous system doesn't even have time to question it. That's not coincidence, that's grooming. And that's my sense on how Cassie may have been groomed. And what is grooming? Clinically, grooming is the strategic process of gaining someone's trust in order to manipulate, exploit, or abuse them without them even seeing it coming. I know, it's complicated. I know. But simply said, what it is, it's getting someone's trust in order to manipulate them. Dr. Jennifer Freed, the leading expert on betrayal trauma, calls it betrayal through attachment. And when someone uses closeness as the very tool of violation, this becomes a very hard part for us to understand. It doesn't feel like abuse when it's happening. It feels like we've been chosen, like we're being elevated, like we're being seen, put up on a pedestal, made to feel like a goddess. And that might have been Cassie's story. And that's why this form of coercion is just so effective. And grooming isn't just a tactic, it's actually a neurological conditioning process. So your brain starts to associate this person with safety, with approval, and hope. And they create a reality where their presence becomes almost like your oxygen, and anything that threatens that bond becomes a threat to your nervous system. Dr. Christine Cordes, a trauma psychologist, she writes that grooming causes confusion because it mimics genuine care. It builds a dependency that's layering love over control, so that by the time that the harm actually happens, you're already doubting your own instincts. And for the people who are already experienced this trauma before, that grooming can feel even more powerful because your nervous system already knows what it's like not to feel safe. So when someone finally makes you feel special, what happens is you bond fast, and that's a survival response. And from survivor's point of view, inside all of us, we could be asking, how did I not see it? The truth is that you did see it, but you also saw the compliments and the connection. And you were trained by them, and maybe even before them, to prioritize the good parts, to ignore your gut. Because God forbid, if you question the dream would just pop like a bubble. And that confusion that comes in afterwards, the pain when you look back, that's called cognitive dissonance. And what that basically is the tension of your brain trying to hold two truths at the one time. It's two realities at once. On one side, it's just like, yeah, this person made me feel amazing. And on the other side, it's like, this person also harmed me so bad. And the brain is trying to coexist in two places at the same time. Dr. Janina Fisher says, the greatest damage comes from grooming isn't the abuse itself, but the way that it erodes our ability to trust ourselves. What that means is that grooming doesn't just, manipulate your mind, it restructures your reality. You start asking, was I naive? Did I let this happen? No, you were conditioned. You were taught to focus on warmth in the fire while ignoring the fire was actually burning you. And there's something that I notice, and I see in a lot of my clients that I work with, because there's a point, and it's a hard shift that happens by realizing that you were groomed. Then that can be the more painful part when the relationship ends. It's just that realization. And what I went through, a lot of it wasn't even real. And this is where so many survivors shut down because seeing the truth feels like a betrayal all over again. And this is where support becomes, very important, because if we don't get support, we can stay stuck in that place for years sometimes. But here's what I need you to know. You weren't complicit. You were groomed. And the fact that you're seeing it now, that means that you're not in it anymore. So if this hurts to hear, it's okay, because you're not breaking. What you're doing is you're unbreaking. You're becoming real again. And this is the beginning of healing. In the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to go deeper into what happens after grooming and how love becomes control and how coercion doesn't always look like abuse. Sometimes it actually looks like loyalty. So let's talk about coercive control and how power can hide in kindness. Coercive control is when power looks like loyalty. So what happens after grooming? What happens when the connection is formed, but something just doesn't feel right anymore? What happens is coercive control. And they're like these invisible strings with unspoken consequences, with the slow erosion of your own autonomy. And get this, it's disguised as love. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of domination that isolates, silences, and dominates someone, not always through attacks, but through psychological warfare. And even the term was introduced by Dr. Evan Stark, a forensic social worker, an expert in domestic abuse. He defines it as a pattern of behavior which seeks to take away a survivor's liberty or freedom and to strip away their sense of self. And that's exactly what coercive control does. So let's talk about, isolation first. Because nobody wakes up one day and says, you know what, I'm going to give up my support system. What actually happens is it happens in fragments. One day, without realizing it, your world shrinks until only one voice is loud enough to matter, and that's their voice. Now let's talk about dependency. Dependency doesn't just mean financial or physical reliance. It's emotional, it's neurological, it's attachment based. And according to attachment theory developed by John Bowlby, we are all biologically wired to seek safety and connection from caregivers, and then later from partners. But when love is fused with fear, approval, and punishment, that attachment becomes, it's just distorted. And you begin to need the very person who is harming you because your nervous system now links their affection to survival. That's not love, it's trauma bonding. So let's look at what Cassie's case teaches us about attachment and isolation. Because let's bring this into the real world. In Cassie's testimony, she described how over time she became isolated from her family, her independence, and her very sense of self. And she said that she was made to perform in ways that she didn't want to, that she was both cared for and controlled at the same time, that she was told what to wear, where to go, who to talk to. Some people say, why didn't you just leave? But here's a deeper truth. She was already gone, not physically, but psychologically. And when you're being controlled through affection, access, status, through punishment, you don't even realize how much of yourself you've actually handed over to somebody else until there's almost nothing left to fight with. And even then, we still hope for the good version of them to come back. Coercive control often hides inside what looks like devotion. Things like is them saying is like, I just want to protect you. No one else understands you like I do. Or, you don't need anyone else. To outsiders, it looks like passion, but to a survivor, it feels like quicksand. Because you're always trying to say the right thing, to wear the right thing, to be in the right mood. Because when things are good, they're so good, and you start to believe that maybe you can earn your way out of the bad, but you can't because the game is rigged and you're not in a relationship anymore. You're actually ensnared in a toxic system where love is currency and compliance is the cost of that. Why this mirrors so many of us, right? Because Cassie's story may not be public, or Cassie's story may be public, but it's not unique. It's the same dynamic that I've heard hundreds of clients say over the years, just without the paparazzi. It's the woman who gave up her career to keep the peace. It's the man who stopped seeing friends because it caused too many fights. It's the parent who lost custody because the other person controlled the narrative and they were too exhausted to fight it. Right? The context changes, yes, but the patterns, of course, of control and manipulation, that does not. And if you're hearing this and realizing it, that was me too. And let me just say this clearly. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you a survivor of psychological system that was designed to trap you. And just like that system was built step by step, you can unbuild it step by step. And we start by naming it. In the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the emotional chaos that keeps us stuck, the hot and cold behavior, the love, the hurt cycle, the unpredictable storms that leave us chasing safety instead of living in it. Because coercive control doesn't just, confuse your heart. It hijacks your nervous system. So let's talk about what that really feels like and how it wires you to stay. So, emotional weather systems, how hot and cold can keep us hooked. So let's talk about, the emotional climate inside these, coercively controlled relationships, and not the rules. I actually want to talk about the weather. Because if you've ever been in one of these relationships, you know what I mean. One moment, it's warm, it's affectionate, it's connected, like everything you ever wanted. And next, it's cold. They withdraw, they accuse, they go silent, they explode over something small. And you're left wondering, what did I do wrong? That's not inconsistency. That's manipulation by emotional atmosphere. And what healthy relationships actually feel like is they draw a clear line because many survivors were never taught what healthy looks like. So, in a healthy relationship, what does that mean? It's like in a healthy relationship, you know where you stand. Affection is consistent, boundaries are respected, disagreements don't lead to punishment, And you can be honest, even when it's hard. You don't feel like you're performing to stay safe. You feel like you're choosing to be there every single day. There's a mutuality to it, right? And that's what real love is built on. In manipulative relationships, it's different. You work for connection, you tiptoe, you edit, you preempt, you scan their faces for signs of danger or withdrawal. You start asking questions like, are they mad at me? Did I say too much? How do I get us back in a good place again? I want to explain the science of trauma bonding. So, Dr. Patrick Carnes, who coined the term trauma bonding, explains it this way. When abuse is paired with reward, the victim becomes psychologically dependent on the abuser. The beyond bond that's created, not despite the pain, but because of it. And that's why the hot and cold behavior is so effective. It doesn't push you away. It keeps you addicted to the relief. The relationship becomes a slot machine. One moment, you get the jackpot, the warmth, the attention, the tenderness, and the next, nothing. Or even worse, you get hostility. And just like that, your nervous system goes into overdrive and the cycle continues. And over time, this unpredictability creates what trauma therapists call, nervous system dysregulation. Your body stops trusting peace because every time things seem okay, something happens. And you learn to associate calm with danger. So you flinch at kindness, you brace in silence, you smile when you want to cry. And this is what Dr. Stephen Porges calls, he's the creator of the polyvagal theory. He calls it neuroception, and it's the subconscious scanning of safety and threat. In coercive relationships, your neuroception becomes very distorted. And what ends up happening is you lose track of what's actually safe. And this is where so many survivors get stuck because the good moments, they were real. But the difference is they weren't safe. And that is a big difference. And that's the line that your healing depends on right now. Because if you're watching this and realizing, I was always walking on eggshells or I didn't have freedom, it's just like I had fear. That's what you had. And the next section we're going to do is we're going to go deeper into the body because coercive control isn't just psychological, it's somatic. We're going to talk about the trauma loop and how your nervous system gets hijacked and how you can begin slowly to take your body back. So let's shift from the mind to the body. Because coercion control doesn't just live in your head, it lives in your chest, in your gut, in your breathing, in your skin. It lives in your nervous system. And even long after the relationship ends, your body can still be bracing for what has already happened. And what that means is that you're in survival. There's a chemical addiction that forms in these abusive dynamics. And when you're in the relationship where love and pain are mixed, your body starts releasing two chemicals in rapid cycles. One is cortisol, and that's a stress hormone. One is dopamine, that's a pleasure reward hormone. When things are chaotic or unpredictable or threatening, your cortisol spikes. And when things calm down, when you're given relief, affection, attention, the dopamine floods your system. And this relief can feel like love. And it's not real safety. It's just emotional whiplash. And that cycle, the fear, the relief, the fear, relief, creates something that feels like bonding, but really it's actually conditioning. And this is why so many survivors say, I still think about them or I miss them, but I know that they're toxic and I feel worse after leaving than I did when I was with them. Well, let me say this plainly. You're not missing the person, you're actually missing the chemicals. And what's actually happening in your body is you're withdrawing because those traumatic bonds, they actually mimic the cycle of addiction. And just like any addiction, the absence of that cycle can feel like unbearable at first. But I'm going to share with you, how the how the trauma loop actually works. Number one is that the first part of the cycle is tension builds. You sense something is off. Number two, there's an explosion that happens. There's going to be blame, silence, withdrawal, punishment. Three, relief comes. It come in the form of apology, affection, sex, gifts. Two, softness. And then four, the body relaxes. And number five, the system resets. We go back to number one. And over time, your nervous system starts anticipating that cycle. So you stay not because they love the person, but because the pattern feels familiar. And when you leave, the system just panics, right? Because now Now there's no hit, there's no fix, there's no chemical flood. It's just silence. And that silence, it doesn't feel like peace, it feels like withdrawal. And healing the trauma loop, you can't do it logically. You can't think your way out of this. You have to rewire the body. And that doesn't happen through willpower. It actually happens through regulation and learning how to recognize when it's activated, and building a new baseline for calm. Reintroducing safety is something that you just have to learn again. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of the book "The Body Keeps the Score," he says, trauma is not just an event that took place in the past. It's also the imprint of what's left by the experience on your mind, your body, your brain. Right? So healing isn't just about remembering what happened. It's about feeling what you couldn't feel when it did, and slowly and safely letting your body know, we're not there anymore. We're here now, and we're safe now. And in the public narrative about Cassie and Diddy, one thing that stood out to me was how long she stayed silent, and how and when she finally did speak up. So many people questioned her, like, why now? But here's the deeper truth. Most survivors don't tell their story until after they've tried everything else. Why? Because telling the truth feels more dangerous than staying quiet. Because when survivors finally do speak, they know what's coming. Smear campaigns, the character assassinations, a replay of their worst moments, taken way out of context. It's why so many survivors don't speak up when they're out, or until they have no other option. And even then, they're still blamed. They're still called crazy. They're still told, you weren't perfect either. But here's a sentence that I've heard told many times. Well, both of them were toxic, but let's be clear. Mutual dysfunction is not the same as mutual power, because just because someone reacted to being abused doesn't mean they were equal participants in the system. In coercive relationships, there's also a power imbalance. One person sets the emotional temperature and the other adjusts to survive it. And when that survivor finally cracks, it becomes evidence that's used against them. And that's not accountability, that's manipulation. Many of us carry deep shame about how we acted at our limit. And that's why we say things like, I became someone I didn't even recognize. I yelled, I lost control. Well, let me say this directly. What you did in survival is not who you are. It's what happened in the moment, and was your nervous system was trying to protect you the only way it knew how. You weren't abusive. You're actually at capacity. And the shame that you feel now, that's what happens when you've been gaslighted into apologizing for reacting. When you were just reacting to pain that was never supposed to be there in the first place. And the turning point, this is where real healing begins. It's not going to be with perfection. It's actually going to be with compassion, with the ability to say, I see what happened to me, and I forgive myself for how I coped with it. Because coercive control turns survivors into shadows of themselves. And recovery isn't about erasing the past, it's about witnessing it without shame. Coercive control rarely happens in isolation. It often happens through a network influence. So there's going to be friends, there's going to be staff, family, advisors, lawyers, followers. What you're actually dealing with isn't just a person, you're dealing with a system. And the role of enablers, and the power is delegated. Because in the case of P. Diddy and Cassie, several court filings and testimonies allege that, he didn't always act alone, that there were others that were involved, individuals who booked hotels, procured drugs, arranged these freak-off encounters, that stood by silently during the assaults, or pretended, not to notice the signs of the trauma. These people may not have raised their voices or laid a hand, but their complicity created the environment where the control could flourish unchecked. And this is what therapists and survivors often refer to as flying monkeys. And that's a term that's coined from, the Wizard of Oz. But, it's used today to describe people who enable, defend, or carry out the narcissist's, emotional agenda. And sometimes they do it willingly, and sometimes they're manipulated themselves. But the outcome is still the same. They become extensions of the abuser's control. And here's where it gets, psychologically damaging. The abuser's control, they control the storyline. And it's not just with you, but everyone around you. They tell others that you're unstable or that you're too emotional or you're the one who just can't let go. And suddenly the people that you once trusted, they start acting differently around you because the pain isn't just in being, doubted. It's that your storyline is actually being rewritten and you're still living your truth, but someone else is narrating it. And that's a unique kind of grief all unto itself. So let's talk about ambiguous loss. And this is what it's like to grieve what's still there. Because the loss of someone who is still physically present, but psychologically absent, it's the pain of losing your reflection in someone else's eyes, right? Because in Cassie's case, in the stories of so many survivors, it's not just about losing the partner, it's also about losing the social circle, the career connections, the emotional safety of community. That's why healing doesn't just involve recovering from them, it also involves grieving the system that protected them and questioning every relationship that was ever built inside it. Because one of the most disorienting experiences for many survivors of this is the silence that follows leaving. Not just the silence from the abuser, but from the people who used to be there, the people who didn't want to take sides, the people that don't believe the whole story, or the people who believe the version of you that they were fed. Because that's the toll of narrative control. They tell their story first and they do it louder, and then you're left cleaning up the fallout. And what survivors need to know, if you're hearing this and you're thinking, this is what happened to me, let me tell you what no one else probably did. You're not imagining it. What you're experiencing is the psychological shrapnel of a campaign where whether it's intentional or not, that was designed to protect their image and not your truth. And when other people become tools of that manipulation, it actually cuts deeper because now it's not just about what they did to you. It's about how everyone else stayed silent while it happened, or worse, even joined in. This is why so many survivors feel stuck, because they're grieving things they're not allowed to grieve. It's less about heartbreak. And it becomes actually about social exile, the kind that doesn't get, cards or casseroles, the kind that just fades quietly until you're the only one left in an empty room trying to make sense of what just happened. And this is the part of recovery that requires, radical witnessing of your own truth. And Cassie may never get a public apology, may never convince the people who believed their version of her. And we don't need others to agree in order for your truth to be real. What happened to you happened, even if they can't or won't see it. And every time you tell your truth anyway, you're reclaiming another piece of your voice. The next section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, what reclamation actually looks like and how you can start to rebuild your identity after it's been erased. So how do you start trusting your instincts again? Well, what it really means is that you stop being their character in their storyline, and you actually become the author of your own story. Right? So let's bring this back to what it actually really feels like when the abuse is over, but your body hasn't caught up yet. Because when they leave, what happens is the panic stays. Cassie's story didn't end when she left. In her sworn testimony, Cassie said that she experienced flashbacks so vivid that it made her black out. And she was diagnosed with PTSD, admitted herself to inpatient treatment center. She was prescribed different medications, right? But it was all to help stabilize her nervous system after years of trauma. And she reported a suicide attempt in 2023, all after that she left. And this is what survivors know in their bones. Leaving doesn't stop the storm. Sometimes when the storm hits the hardest, it's actually being in the relationship for some who's more stable since they're reactionary, and it keeps the PTSD symptoms down. And that's why a lot of abuse sufferers end up going back to their abusers because of how painful it is for to be outside of them. And when we leave, the nervous system doesn't know it's over yet. And Cassie didn't just leave the relationship. She left a system of control, of isolation, of humiliation and fear. And the body keeps the score. And that's not a metaphor, that's actual science. What she described, the flashbacks, the panic, shutdowns, the inability to feel safe, even in peaceful moments. It's a clinical definition of complex CPTSD, right? And CPTSD is what happens when your brain and body adapt to long-term emotional harm. And it's not about one terrifying moment. It's actually about years of being worn down, confused, ignored, punished, or used. And the symptoms don't always look like the people expect. Cassie's story includes somatic flashbacks, those moments where the body reacts to threats that are happening now. They're not just images, they're actual sensations, a heart racing, a wave of panic or shame. That's the body remembering what your brain is trying to forget. In interviews and filings, Cassie described a life of constant tension. She didn't know when the mood would change and when love would flip into punishment. That unpredictability wires the brain for hypervigilance, a constant scanning for tone, body language, danger. So you can't relax. And even when you're safe, you still don't feel free. And this is why so many people go back. Not because they love the person, but because the withdrawal from the trauma bonding mimics grief and addiction, and it also mimics panic all at once. Because trauma bonded, relationships, the quiet always comes before the next explosion. So even when they're gone, your body waits for the next hit. I want to say, like Cassie's courage, and this is like the mirror. And what Cassie is living through right now is the aftermath, the rebuilding, the reckoning with what her nervous system learned just to stay alive. And that's not a weakness. It's trauma recovery. It's the part that no one glamorizes. And I describe it as detoxing from chaos, because it's the grief of realizing, it never was love, it was control. And what this means for you, if you're watching this and you're thinking that's me, it probably is. Not the public part, but the private part. The part where your body still holds on to something that you thought that you left behind. And that doesn't mean that you're broken. It means that you're human. It means that your nervous system is doing what it was trained to do, and that was survive. And healing. Healing, doesn't start with just being okay. It starts with understanding why you're not. In the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the slow, brave return to our identity becomes. Because people like Cassie and people like you learn to rebuild a sense of self after being erased, minimized, and made to feel small. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about what it means to stop surviving them and to start, becoming you again. Right? Because Cassie isn't the only one who stayed too long. She wouldn't be the last. And she's talking now. That actually matters. Because in a system built on silence, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Because healing doesn't start with forgiveness, it starts with truth. And Cassie, told the court that she had buried what happened for years, that she minimized it, that she was afraid to speak. And that's how trauma keeps you trapped. It makes silence feel safer than honesty. But here's the thing. Recovery begins the moment that you name what happened. That's when the nervous system starts to shift, because what was once unspeakable now becomes spoken. And with every single truth that's spoken out loud using words, whether it's in therapy, whether it's in writing or whispers, and, to a trusted friend, you can step forward back into your steps, into yourself, right? So what we're going to do now is just going to give you a couple different ways of thinking about what Cassie's story teaches us about us, right? Because Cassie may be famous, yes, but the feelings that she described, the trauma, the silence, the confusion, that's universal for survivors, right? Because what her recovery doesn't look like in the headlines, it doesn't look like heroics. What it actually looks like is therapy. It looks like withdrawal from trauma bonds. It looks like confronting shame, telling the truth, and building safety for the first time from the inside out. And if you're watching this, you're on that path too. And it's not going to be perfect. Right? And it's not going to happen all at once, but piece by piece. And trust me, those pieces matter. Because every time that you tell your truth, every time that you stop apologizing for existing, every time that you stay with yourself instead of abandoning your truth and you stay connected, what you're doing is you're healing. And that's what recovery actually looks like. The next and final section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, what's waiting at the end of this road, not the illusion of closure, but what's more real, and that's freedom, and what it means to build a life long after, you've left these relationships. We're going to talk about, what life around you looks like, because you're not alone in this. This P. Diddy Cassie case, made the headline. But what it actually revealed happens every single day in places that no one ever sees. What Cassie described in this case study of coercive control, and whether you saw parts of her story into you, in her flashbacks, in her guilt, in her silence, or in her rebuilding. What you realize is the story isn't about them. It's about us. It's about what happens to people who are manipulated, who want to feel wanted and want to feel love, and loses the pieces of themselves. They get broken down slowly until they forget what safety actually feels like. And the fact that you're still here, still watching, tells me something. You're not gone. You're waking up. And I want to ask you something. I don't feel like you need to answer in the comments, but I do want you to ask yourself, like, what part of this story of P. Diddy and Cassie hit you the hardest? What are you still kind of unpacking? What are you still working through? And what does safety mean to you now? Not what someone else told you that you needed to feel safe, but what does real, actual safety look like and feel like? Because here's what we're going to find is that healing doesn't start with doing everything right. It actually starts by noticing. Start by saying, hey, wait, this was me. I went through that too. With naming what you've never been able to name before. Cassie's courage actually reminds us that speaking up is not easy. And it can feel dangerous. It can also feel lonely. And many of you watching this, you're not doing this on your own. You're on your own path to recovery. And many of you are doing it in private. But you're doing it without the headlines. You're doing it without the press coverage. But just because your story isn't in the news doesn't make it any less real. And the damage doesn't need to be in the public to be deserving of healing. So I just want you to say, you're invited to join us. If anything in this case study made you feel seen, if you're realizing that you got sucked into a toxic dynamic and that they stole your voice and eroded your boundaries and made you doubt yourself, you don't have to figure out this alone, because every week I host a group, and it's called the Recovery Healing Cycle. It's not therapy, it's community. And it's a place for survivors of narcissistic abuse and coercive control to breathe, to process, to rebuild together. And we can also take deeper dives into recovery work is through healing immersions and one-on-one work. Right? You can also book a free private call with me. We'll talk. It's just give you some space. The links are in the description. And if you've been silenced for long enough, I just want you to know that you deserve to be heard. You deserve to be supported. You deserve to heal from everything. And at the end of the day, this case study wasn't about Cassie. It wasn't about Diddy. It wasn't about the allegations or the crimes or about the systems. It was about the systems of coercion and the emotional toll that so many people that have lived with inside. And, it's one that gets built around fear and silence. But now you see it. And that's where the real recovery begins. Because when you stop questioning the pain, start trusting the part of you that knew something was wrong all along, I just want you to know this is your invitation to come back into yourself. So come join the healing work. You're waking up. Thank you for watching, and thank you for subscribing, and thank you for your likes and your comments and support.